What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony, let's jump in.
Okay, happy Thursday everybody. Before we move into the main stories, it's currently being leaked that a bipartisan group of US senators led by the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez, is expected to land in Taipei, Taiwan any minute now. Taiwanese media reports that the group will meet with leader Tsai Ing-wen and then leave to return to the US tomorrow, Friday evening, East Asia time. We will follow the trip over the next few days. With prolonged unpopular lockdowns in Shanghai and across the country, and increasing numbers of domestic voices expressing deep concern for the economy, more on this shortly, the question on many lips over the last few weeks has been, will leadership in Beijing begin to transition away from the so-called dynamic zero cases policy? Over the last 24 hours, top leadership has provided an answer. No. Xi Jinping pointed out that the current global pandemic is still very serious, so we cannot relax the prevention and control work. Persistence is victory. Adhere to people above all else, life above all else, adhere to the prevention of imported cases, a rebound of domestic cases, adhere to scientific precision, dynamic zero COVID, grasp the details of the epidemic prevention and control initiatives. End quote. Every major state media platform has published apologist articles supportive of the current COVID policy over the last 24 hours. The fact that we have seen such a jump in state media articles over the last few days justifying and explaining the strict zero cases policy suggests that officials are concerned with the level of dissatisfaction and frustration coming from Shanghainese and other residents. The main humanitarian argument presented is that with China's massive population, limited per capita medical resources, relatively ineffective vaccines, and general lack of natural immunity, if COVID, even in its weakest state, were allowed to wash over the population, then millions would die. And this may well be the case. However, even a commentator who accepts this may yet still push back a little and ask, then what is the eventual off-ramp? What is the end game policy? And authorities have yet to articulate a compelling answer to this question. Now that's the humanitarian argument. The political argument, of course, and this is unspoken obviously, is that this is the top leader's policy, so until he changes his mind, the system must implement this policy. Shanghai police made sure that residents in the megacity are getting with the program too, publishing a special notice online last night reminding people of the rules and concluding with, quote, "Those who violate the provisions of this notice will be dealt with in strict accordance with the law by public security organs. If it constitutes a crime, they will be investigated according to the law." End quote. Washington-based China analyst Bill Bishop sums all this up this way, quote, "The message to Shanghai and everyone else is clear. Suck it up for the good of the country. The policy is not going to change in any fundamental way, and we are going to grind through the pandemic and anything or any person that gets in the way." End quote. Cases and restrictions are leaking out of Shanghai into neighboring regions, which make up the critically important Yangtze River Delta region. Lockdown orders have been introduced in some parts of Kunshan, about an hour north of Shanghai. Dozens of producers of critical electronic components on yesterday, halted production at their factories in the city. Suzhou, a high-tech industrial hub of 13 million people in Jiangsu province, part of which hugs Shanghai, has reported more than 400 local infections over the past 30 days, most with links to Shanghai, according to local authorities. It was announced yesterday that the city will be divided into 3 districts, with 3 levels of restrictions according to risk levels. Next, we're going to look at, once again, the economic cost of all this. As always, guys, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit the like button. And for anyone who wants to go the extra mile, as always, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and crypto links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for all the ongoing support. Let's continue. So the current policy is here to stay, and that means very high risk of costly economic disruptions. Many Western countries have chosen to coexist with the virus, so as long as their healthcare systems are well equipped to cope with critical cases, the number of confirmed cases will not impact their COVID-19 control measures. On the contrary, China's zero-COVID approach means that a relatively small case number is still enough to shut down a city. In a research paper published a few days ago by 5 prominent economists from both Chinese and US universities, including Tsinghua University in Beijing and Princeton University in the US, the authors concluded that more large-scale COVID lockdowns in the country would, unsurprisingly, cause very heavy economic damage. The paper, titled "The Economic Cost of Locking Down Like China," argues that if China's 4 largest cities, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, underwent a full 1-month lockdown, similar to what we're seeing in Shanghai, then China's inflation-adjusted GDP, also known as the real GDP, could fall 8.6% during that period. This represents a 0.75% drop in annual GDP. And these are just lockdowns in these 4 cities and just for 1 month. The paper also gives the worst case scenario, a month-long lockdown of all cities in the country, or a nationwide lockdown. In this case, the paper concludes that the damage would be a 53% reduction in GDP. A link to this paper is in the description below. Co-author Song said that a major reason for the greater economic cost of a lockdown in China is its higher level of strictness and enforceability of lockdown measures. As of Monday, a total of 45 cities in China were under full or partial lockdowns. They make up 26.4% of the country's population and 40.3% of its GDP. Economists at Nomura Holdings Limited wrote in a report that day. End quote. We know from data published by Beijing-based Gevakel Dragonomics earlier this week that only 13 of the largest 100 cities in China have no form of restrictions in place. Okay, next up, Singaporean leaders have always been interesting voices to listen to on US-China matters, often respected by Western and Chinese thinkers alike as sitting somewhere in the middle of the two civilizations, thus able to give a unique perspective for consideration. For the quote of the week, I wanted to look at part of a speech that the current Prime Minister of Singapore made this week to a US audience, though as we will see, perhaps he is also signaling to a Chinese audience too. Quote, "There is strong perception in some parts of the world, including in China, quite explicitly, that the East is rising and the West is declining, that you do not have a bright future because the world is changing too fast for a system like the United States, a democracy with checks and balances. I do not believe this at all. I know you have a lot of problems and you are very preoccupied with them and you do not see a ready solution to them, but to conclude that the US is a country with no future is a very, very rash assumption to make. It is a bet which, if proven wrong, which is very likely, is going to cost. Cost in overly ambitious plans, cost in overly complacent assumptions, cost in being aggressive in ways which are going to cause a problem, not just with the United States, but with the rest of the world." End quote. Okay, last up, energy and China. The Paris-based International Energy Agency, IEA, has cut its forecast for global oil demand this year, in part due to the new series of lockdowns that we have been seeing in China these last few weeks. With weaker demand and increased supply due to the release of emergency oil reserves by IEA states, the agency, quote, "now sees global markets in balance for much of the year." End quote, with Bloomberg reporting that crude prices, quote, "have already lost most of their gains since Russia's attack on Ukraine, trading near $100 a barrel Wednesday in New York." End quote. The financial outlet also reports that the IEA lowered projections for world fuel consumption this year by 260,000 barrels a day, with a particularly steep reduction of 925,000 a day for China in April. Still, despite all this, global demand remains on track to increase this year. And this will still cost Chinese industry. After all, China is the world's biggest importer of crude oil. According to speakers at the 2022 Oil Market Development Conference being held in Beijing this week, China may have to pay nearly $100 billion more for purchases of fuel this year due to the surge in international prices. Analysts with Hsien argue that this jump will likely squeeze profits in downstream industries such as refining, chemical production, and textiles. And while we're on this theme, Reuters reports yesterday that according to its quote-unquote industry sources, China's top offshore oil and gas producer CNOOC Limited is preparing to exit its operations in Britain, Canada, and the United States because of concerns in Beijing that assets could become subject to Western sanctions. Reuters writes that as it seeks to leave the West, CNOOC is looking to acquire new assets in Latin America and Africa, and also wants to prioritize the development of large new prospects in Brazil and Uganda.
Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.